Hello, this is Angelica Hadding. Patriot Dreams is proud to present this legacy story, a deeply personal narrative drawn from the life of Dennis and Kasia Popiel. Each legacy story is shaped from first-person interviews, historical documents, and personal artifacts shared with us during the research process. These elements are carefully woven into a work of creative nonfiction that honors the subject's voice, values, and lived experience. This story has been reviewed and approved for publication by Dennis and Kasia Popiel and is published exclusively by Patriot Dreams. We are honored to have been entrusted with this legacy. May it inspire you to reflect on your own story and to preserve it for future generations. Long before she became an American citizen, a wife, a caregiver, or a mother, Kasia Mandziuk was a young woman longing for freedom. Her life began in the small village of Zilka, near the Ukrainian border in southeastern Poland. Her parents, Jan and Stanisława, were devout Catholics and hardworking farmers. They raised their children in a house filled with love on a small plot of land where wheat, potatoes, and tobacco struggled to grow in thin, temperamental soil. Their lives had been shaped by hardship, Nazi occupation, food shortages, and communist control. There was no real freedom here, and this was an environment where it truly had no chance of ever growing. Kasia's mother was once forced to watch as every 10th man in their village was killed because the Nazis had accused someone of stealing a horse. Committing such atrocities was as much the Nazis' way of intimidating everyone in the village as it was an irrational attempt at compelling a confession. Kasia's father was often forced to help bury the dead, including those who had been killed at nearby Belzec extermination camp, which was built by the SS solely for the purpose of murdering every last Polish Jew. Even though years had passed since the Nazi occupation, the days without violence still brought fear. Although there were no visible chains around their feet, they were still chained nonetheless. Their hard work had to yield enough to pay the government first, and the family was forced to subsist on whatever remained. Life's most persistent lesson in those days was to save what you could and to give where it mattered most. Before they worked the land each day, Kasia's parents would kneel and pray. Attending church meant walking 3.5 miles, so most of the families in Kasia's village would only attend on Sunday or for special services at Christmas and Easter. But Kasia's father went to church several times a week and was known in the community for always being prayerful. Adults in the close-knit community viewed raising children as a shared responsibility, meaning every watchful eye was an extension of her father and mother. As a result, faith and the expectation of doing good were ever present. Kasia witnessed the quiet and unassuming strength of her parents every day. She watched her father work in unforgiving fields, even when his hands trembled with exhaustion. She watched her mother care for animals, prepare meals, and walk miles to church in every season, in all kinds of weather. Her parents modeled resilience, dignity, prayer, and kindness. Despite their hardships, they also modeled a true spirit of charity, always giving from what little they had to help someone in need. The lessons they taught her would leave an indelible mark on Kasia in both big and small ways, as would Kasia's own knowledge of the world around her. Despite the gratefulness she felt for her many blessings, and there were many, Kasia knew the limits of life behind the Iron Curtain. Stores were often empty. Basic goods were scarce. Political pressure was constant. Kasia's parents ached as they watched her grow into a young woman who, through no fault of her own, was limited by circumstances that were far beyond their control. And so, in 1981, just before martial law was declared, Kasia made a decision that would forever change her life. Kasia would leave Poland. Making all the necessary arrangements was neither easy nor without significant risk. She had to bribe officials to obtain a passport. Only her parents and siblings knew that she planned to leave and not return. In an act of complete selflessness rooted in the greatest parental love, her parents knew that letting go of Kasia was the best thing they could do for her. Not knowing whether she would ever see her family again, she walked away from everything familiar and stepped bravely and boldly into the unknown. For 4.5 months, Kasia lived in a political refugee camp in Austria, waiting for a country to offer her a future. Representatives from South Africa, Australia, Canada, and the United States interviewed her. She could have left sooner if she had chosen one of the first two, but she waited, feeling strongly that North America would offer the best chance to someday reunite with her family. Although she had left her parents in a physical sense, her heart remained with them, and with everyone in her village who was struggling. With equal measures of faith and hope, Kasia waited patiently for God to open doors. Her fervent prayers would be answered, and in April of 1982, the United States finally accepted her as a refugee. She boarded a plane with a small suitcase, very little money, enormous determination, and faith. She arrived in Michigan, not speaking English, but ready to work as hard as necessary to build a new life. Hardship and endurance marked Kasia's first years in America. She lived with other immigrants in a small apartment. She worked for $5 an hour cleaning houses, taking any work she could find. From her meager existence, she still found a way to share what she had with her family back in Poland every month. Packages filled with medicine, clothing, and support for her struggling family. During these long and grueling days, she often went to bed hungry. Working tirelessly, she went to school at night to learn English and study dental technology. When she couldn't find work in that field, she returned to school once again and trained as an auto body designer. In August 1982, only 4 months after arriving in America, Kasia met a young man named Dennis Popiel at a dance in Hamtramck, Michigan. Dennis was immediately drawn to her kindness and quiet strength. He talked at length that night to Kasia, not realizing until later that Kasia could not understand much of what he was saying. They would soon begin dating, and despite the language barrier, their connection grew. Kasia kept a dictionary with her on their dates and used it to translate Dennis's jokes and stories. As he listened with eager ears to Kasia's story, Dennis would open the pages of his life to Kasia, introducing her to all the key figures in his world in Detroit, Michigan. Dennis told Kasia about his father, John Popiel, a man who was known for his strong work ethic. He explained how John was forced into early manhood when, at just the tender age of 15, John's father was fatally struck by a streetcar just a few days before Christmas. John, along with his twin brother, quit school and went to work to help provide for the family. From that day forward, John never stopped working. He would pass away at the age of 54, not knowing what it was like to take a vacation or ride on a plane. Working hard was how he showed his love and his dedication to his family. It was a love that was so strong that stories of his work ethic would become the stuff of legend. Everyone in the community would come to know John's reputation as a tireless worker. Much like Kasia's parents, Dennis's father had to be strong because his circumstances left him with no other option. Especially since Dennis's mother, Theodora, had been very ill for as long as he could remember. She would spend months at the hospital, participating in clinical research trials. Although she lived to be 74 years old, she was never able to overcome her illness. Years later, in a cruel twist of fate, one of the only treatments that proved helpful would eventually cause other diseases that would ultimately take her life. While Dennis's family had been unable to attend Mass regularly due to his mother's health and his father's need to work unceasingly to provide for the family, they still had a foundation of faith, albeit a more subtle one than Kasia's family. Nevertheless, faith was ever present. When John had fallen gravely ill and had been admitted to the hospital for what would be the last time, Dennis, just 20 years old, reached out to the hospital chaplain to request a visit to administer last rites. When they spoke on the phone the very next day, the priest let Dennis know that John had already reached out to him for the very same reason, and that he had already visited with him in the hospital. That one phone call gave Dennis a profound new understanding of his father, a new prism through which Dennis would revisit his memories of his father for the rest of his life. As Dennis and Kasia shared their stories, it became increasingly apparent that something was drawing them together. They came from vastly different yet similar backgrounds. They liked many of the same things, and they took great interest in getting to know each other better. But beyond the superficial things that they knew would contribute toward a healthy relationship, they wanted their lives to be firmly rooted in their shared Catholic faith. It was, after all, a gift that had been handed down to them by their parents. The two became one on July 21st, 1984. It was the beginning of a partnership built on shared values. In 1990, while working as an auto body designer, Kasia met Mr. Kazimierz Sadlo, a retired Chrysler employee. He was a gentle Polish man who was already in the autumn of his years. His wife, Ludmiła, was Russian-born. They had no children and no close family in the United States. Over time, the Sadlos grew increasingly close to Kasia. When Mr. Sadlo's health declined, they asked her to help them with errands and appointments. Eventually, they asked her to take power of attorney for both of them, medical, financial, and general. It was a responsibility Kasia accepted only after seeing how alone they truly were. As their health deteriorated, Kasia cared for them with the dedication of a daughter, driving them to dialysis, cooking meals, cleaning their home, handling bills, paying taxes, helping with medications, and ensuring they were never left to face illness alone. The Sadlos, not having any children or family to inherit their estate, chose Kasia as their beneficiary. When the Sadlos died in 2011 and 2012, Kasia handled their funerals and maintained their graves each year. Their estate eventually passed to her, just as they had intended. This was a testament to their appreciation for Kasia's care and proved to be a much-needed gift, enabling Dennis and Kasia to continue their work blessing the lives of others. Importantly, it would help them recover from financial hardships that resulted from pursuing the greatest desire of their hearts, a family. Kasia and Dennis longed to have children. With a shortage of good homes for orphan children, they could have chosen many easy paths toward adoption. But after much prayer, they both felt that God laid it on their hearts that they should adopt an orphan from a Polish institution. Fate would intervene in 1991, when Kasia's brother and his wife, facing hardship, limited resources, and another pregnancy, asked Kasia and Dennis to adopt their soon-to-be-born child. They agreed. Throughout 1991, Kasia and Dennis found themselves sitting in a series of government offices, small, windowless rooms where fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the walls were lined with framed posters reminding them of the rules they were trying so hard to follow. The Immigration and Naturalization Service had a process, and Dennis and Kasia intended to respect every inch of it. They answered their questions, repeated in different ways, sometimes twice, sometimes 3 times, as agents compared their statements, checked their backgrounds, and studied their home life with a scrutiny usually reserved for courtrooms. There was a home study, the kind that requires you to open your closets, your finances, and bare your very soul to strangers holding clipboards. There were interviews, fingerprinting, and verifications. At every step, they nodded, smiled, and cooperated. At times, they did not feel seen. They felt less than human on some red tape conveyor belt that seemed perfectly designed to shatter their dreams. "We want to do everything the right way," they repeated like a shared mantra. Not because it was what the strangers holding clipboards wanted to hear, but because they genuinely did. This was not some perfunctory thing that meant little to them. Quite the opposite. It meant everything, because this was for their child. On November 1st, 1991, after months of waiting and praying, The INS issued its ruling. Approved. The word landed like sunlight on a blanket of snow after a long winter. They packed their suitcases and flew to Poland, with a mixture of hope and anticipation tucked into every pocket. On December 20th, 1991, in a small Polish courthouse, they formally adopted their son, surrounded by the cold air of winter, but filled with the warmth of knowing their family had just expanded by one. They believed the hard part was behind them. But in early January 1992, standing inside the American embassy in Warsaw with their son bundled in their arms, they learned how fragile hope can be. An official, polite, firm, unmoved, told them they could not take their son home. He explained, with the kind of detached authority that felt almost unreal, that their son, in fact, was not abandoned by his birth parents, and therefore did not meet the definition of an orphan under U.S. law. For a moment, the world stood still. The noise faded. Joy collapsed into something sharp and breathless. They had followed every rule. They had done everything by the book. And yet, in that embassy office, everything they had worked for, the interviews, the home study, the approval, the adoption, seemed to vanish in a single sentence. Their son was in their arms, but they could not bring him home. For more than 6 months, they sought help from attorneys, senators, congressional offices, and church networks. Doors seemed to close at every turn. Finally, through a complicated series of events, including a denied visa in Warsaw, an unexpected opportunity in Rome, and remarkable good fortune, they obtained a Canadian visa for their son in 1992. Kasia flew with him to Montreal. Dennis met them by boat from the U.S. They re-entered the country quietly, without the proper paperwork to allow their child to enter legally. They were determined to raise their son in the only place they called home. In 2000, the 2 younger brothers of their previously adopted son visited Michigan with their father. They were 10 and 8 years old. Both boys, for reasons they struggled to articulate, refused to return to Poland. Over time, Dennis and Kasia learned about the boys' difficult experiences. Without hesitation, they accepted the children into their home, even though this meant supporting 3 undocumented minors. The boys were enrolled in Catholic schools, provided tutoring, received medical care, and, most importantly, were given some stability. Dennis and Kasia knew the boys could not become U.S. citizens without adoption, but adoption was legally challenging because of their ages, and now because of their living arrangement. Through determination and the help of a compassionate attorney, Dennis and Kasia adopted both boys just days before one of the boys turned 16, the last age at which adoption would allow them to remain in the country. It became the fastest international adoption in Michigan history. There are moments in a parent's life when faith becomes more than a belief. It becomes the air you breathe, the ground you stand on, the only strength you have left. For Dennis and Kasia, the long journey to make their 3 sons legal U.S. citizens was one of those moments. Looking back, they know with certainty that none of it happened by accident. Every approval, every unexpected opening, every door that should have stayed shut but somehow swung wide, those weren't coincidences. They were quiet miracles, carried by prayers said on worn wooden pews and whispered in the stillness of chapels. There were stretches of time when Dennis and Kasia practically lived on their knees, knelt in prayer where the faithful go with heavy burdens, placing them gently into God's hands. Day after day, they would pray, sometimes with words, sometimes with nothing but tears and hope. They prayed for guidance, for protection, for the strength to keep going when the paperwork seemed endless and the path ahead was uncertain. They prayed for each of their sons by name. They prayed for miracles. And somehow, in ways that a purely logical mind struggles to comprehend, God answered. Not all at once, and not always in the way they expected, but always in the way they needed. After nearly 17 years of facing numerous obstacles, excessive legal expenses, extensive paperwork, unwavering perseverance, and prayer, all three sons achieved U.S. citizenship. The two children adopted within the United States received their citizenship there. Their middle son, adopted in Poland in 1991, had to return to Poland with his adoptive parents in 2008 under precarious circumstances to secure his American citizenship. Dennis later recalled that one of the happiest moments for both him and his son was when a customs officer greeted his middle son with, "Welcome to the United States." Dennis and his son exchanged a warm smile and tearful glance, bonded by years of living undocumented in America. The Popiel home was full of challenges, certainly, but also full of love. Raising three boys brought joy, busy schedules, and pressure. The financial strain of caring for three young boys was tremendous. But just as they had always done, they found a way to get by while still sending help to others who needed it. They brought Kasia's elderly mother to the U.S. in 1996 after Kasia's father waited to die in her arms and cared for her until her passing at age 95 in 2021. When needed, they supported relatives facing medical or economic hardship, and they still managed to deliver food and laundry to their sons away at college and drive hundreds of miles across multiple states to assist their eldest son during college internships. Every year, they opened their home on Thanksgiving to anyone without a place to go. But most importantly, Dennis and Kasia led a Sunday night family rosary outside their church for nearly 10 years. These were all acts of love that they count as joy. Over the years, Kasia and Dennis had guided 13 people into new lives in the United States. Sons by adoption, an aging parent, siblings, friends, an extended family whose futures had become intertwined with their own. Each one was carried in their prayers by name every day. They prayed for their three sons and their families, for the biological parents of those sons, for Kasia's mother and siblings, for the friend's child they sponsored who later married and built a thriving life, and even for those who had drifted away. Among the many souls they lifted in prayer was a young niece whose journey through their lives had been both a blessing and a quiet ache. She had come to them as a teenager, a gentle and uncertain 18-year-old who traveled from Poland to Michigan in 1998 to visit Kasia and Dennis. With her limited English, Kasia planned her flights so she wouldn't have to navigate airport transfers on her own. Dennis and their middle son met her in Chicago and brought her home, where the family welcomed her warmly. During her visit, the niece confided to Kasia that she had endured abuse back in Poland. Kasia carried the weight of that confession and soon shared it with Dennis. When the time came for the young woman to return home, Kasia and Dennis drove back from the airport in silence. The heaviness of sending their niece back into a horrible situation became more than they could bear. Prayerfully, they made a choice. They would bring her to the United States again, this time to give her a chance at a safer, more promising life. With Dennis and Kasia's support and encouragement, the niece earned a scholarship to attend a nearby college as a foreign exchange student. She applied herself with dedication and, with their help, began building a new life in Michigan. As time passed, she chose to take her next steps independently, pursuing her own path. Life can turn quickly, and when challenges later arose, Dennis and Kasia came to her aid without hesitation, offering reassurance, care, and steady support. But in the natural ebb and flow of life, their connection eventually faded again. 10 years later, in 2011, after the passing of her father, Kasia's niece reached out in grief, seeking comfort and familiarity during a difficult time. Dennis and Kasia responded immediately, traveling a great distance to be with her and gently encouraging her to return with them to Michigan. Together, they made the long drive home, arriving just in time for Sunday Mass on Mother's Day. For Kasia's mother, who had been praying faithfully for their safe return, seeing her granddaughter and great-granddaughter walk through the door felt like a blessing, a moment filled with grace on a day meant to honor mothers. Back in Michigan, the niece and her daughter became part of the Popiel household. They shared daily life, support, and loving community, strengthening the bonds that connected their families. In time, the niece chose to move forward in a new direction. Even from afar, she and her daughter always remained in the hearts of the Popiels, one of the 13 lives Dennis and Kasia had been privileged to lift, support, and guide along their journeys. To anyone else looking in on the Popiels' situation at any point in time, it all may have seemed impossible, and the truth of the matter is that they took on much more than they ever thought they could carry. But for Dennis and Kasia, it all came down to one simple truth. God is able to make every grace abundant for you, so that in all things, having all you need, you may have an abundance for every good work. Grace. It's a word that carries many meanings and great importance. To Christians, grace is God's unmerited favor, manifested fully in salvation. Grace between humans is an act of honoring one another through kindness and compassion. It's an act of extending the kind of love that expects nothing in return. It's an act of honoring that love once it is given, by choosing to return it selflessly and without keeping score. It's giving all that you have. It's the widow's mite. It's understanding that God sees proportion, not portion. As a young girl in Zilka, Kasia watched as her parents gave all they could, even though they had very little. When all Kasia's father had to give was prayer, he gave it in abundance. As a young man in Detroit, Michigan, Dennis understood that his father had given up his childhood when his family needed the labor of his young hands to help them survive. He understood that his mother gave all she could to find a way to heal her body so that she could be fully present as a mother to her family. The Sadlows watched as Kasia labored to care for them, even as she struggled to care for her own family, and they chose to bless her with all that they had. Dennis and Kasia's sons grew as their parents gave their time, support, love, and home to those who needed them the most. Grace. They pray for the continued opportunity to help those who need it, and they persevere with faith that weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. Kasia and Dennis continue to pray daily for their sons, for their daughters-in-law, their niece, and for their grandchildren. They want their grandchildren to know that they come from a family of charity, forgiveness, and faith. Their fervent prayer is that God will bless them, protect them, and bring peace where there is struggle. And for all who hear this message, know that you are loved. Dennis and Kasia want their legacy to be a legacy of grace, a legacy of giving, a legacy of love without condition. They want their children and their grandchildren to know that they crossed oceans, fought for visas, lost sleep, sacrificed comforts, cried and prayed because of love. They did their best to be a model of kindness, humility, respect, and the power of prayer because of love. And that love remains unchanged. It doesn't lie dormant. It grows. Like the wheat young once faithfully planted in the unyielding soil, it grows even in the harshest of conditions. It grows with perseverance, compassion, and faith. With faith, there is always room for love to grow. With it, there is an endless supply of forgiveness and mercy, if only we would choose to give it. All of us can choose to be part of a cycle of grace in a world that tries to convince us all that to survive, you have to take. And be kind and merciful to one another, forgiving one another, just as God has forgiven you in Christ.